Now, a truly abstract painting lets go of the subject altogether. The one we've just looked at by Wendy MacDonald was still really, grounded in the experience of looking at a tree, gauging different tonal values based on shadow and light. But in this painting, all the elements of painting, tone, colour, form and space, are activated in relation to shapes, and the shapes are evocative. The title of the work is Hedera. I don't know if that's actually a location or more an evocative poetic title, establishing a mood, which abstract painters often use. But whatever the title means, the subject is not altogether clear. I see it as rocks myself. I see it as the relationship between rocks and atmosphere. But there's nothing to finally, authorise that reading of the work. And that's what's, I think, successful about it as an abstract painting. It evokes different responses, and yet it doesn't finally settle in any one spot. And in the end, what we're left with is the contemplation of painting's structure, the structure of the painting itself. We've got a bit back to tonalism here. I was talking about Ian Grant's work first and the restricted palette. This is also a relatively restricted palette. But here, the force of the black is what carries that tonal palette. If you block the blacks out with your fingers, it's actually a really delicate painting. And I urge you to do that. This is what you have to do in the studio when you want to see a part without seeing all the other parts. It's actually it becomes a colour painting. The yellow dances against the pink, and the blue comes to the fore against the warm grey. But put the blacks in and it solidifies everything, it quietens the colour, and gives a real weight to this image that, as I said, I can only really see as rocks and atmosphere. Now, I think he's actually starting to add to that conversation within abstraction, so within the tradition of sort of abstraction that adds to landscape, the tradition of abstraction related to landscape, he is actually really pushing towards something that is distinctly his own. This painting, this Aboriginal artist, Hosea Omino, the painting is called My Own Land is River, Sea and Earth. Hosea Omino comes from Lockhart River, which is North Queensland, near the Great Barrier Reef. And he's part of what I suppose you could call the flourishing, the ongoing flourishing of Aboriginal art, which has a relatively short history in Australian art, even though it's always been there. But just to cover the ground there. In the late 50s, early 60s, Dr. Stuart Scargill was a doctor from Sydney who, with Tony Tuxon, who worked at the Art Gallery of New South Wales, went on trips to Tiwi Island, Bathurst and Melville Islands, north of Australia. And they were some of the first people to actually collect Aboriginal art as artworks for the purposes of putting them into an art gallery. And many of those bark paintings and poles, Pukamani poles, burial poles, can be seen in the art gallery today. So that was a real shift as recently as the late 50s, early 60s, away from seeing Aboriginal works as ethnographic works, just examples of a culture, an old culture, towards putting them in a museum alongside European artworks and giving them status as a different tradition. Then, of course, the next development towards what we now recognise as this kind of painting would have been in the 1970s, early 70s, when Geoffrey Barden, a school teacher, went to Papunya, a settlement in the Western Desert, and got the senior men in the community to paint the honey ant dreaming on the doors of the school, just the old plain, plywood doors, I imagine they were. But they painted them in acrylic paint, and of course that new medium with the old stories yielded these wonderful paintings that have kick-started, what we would now call the Aboriginal art. Well, you could call it a movement, or you could call it a market as well, because it's obviously come to be probably the most prominent face of Australian art overseas. So within 20 years, it went from being not really recognised as art at all to being a really important, probably the most prominent face of Australian art. But back to this work. We could traditionally think of dot painting, that's the archetypal image of Aboriginal painting. This is a slightly different language. It involves, that kind of dabbing of the brush, but it's a different sense of form. It's a very buoyant painting, and the title, I'll just reread that title. My own land is river, sea and earth. The title and the painting really match. There's that sense of a swirling kind of reality of everything, whether it's water, sea or earth, becoming part of one rhythm or energy. And the brilliant colour here, going back to Wendy MacDonald's painting, this is which at that point in my talk was the most kind of colourful painting. Well, this takes us further again towards absolute pure colour. And one of the reasons for the success of Aboriginal art is that whilst it is grounded in that other tradition, it also accords with Western ideas of abstractness and enjoying a picture just for its colour properties and play of shape and space. What I see happening spatially in this picture is that you've got these kind of clam-like shapes dancing out in front, the light colours coming forward and the blues sitting back, so that what might appear or you might think of as a flat picture, as a flat space, is actually dancing continually between these slightly forward forms and a ground that sort of gives a base to that. I really enjoy this painting for the way you can travel into different areas and enjoy a whole different colour palette, the yellow to cold green and pink down here, to a much more primary sort of red, yellow, blue feel up there.